All right, so now we're going to switch our attention to specifically globalization and human rights. Kind of keep in mind our theories of international political economy, mercantilism, or what might be referred to today as economic nationalism, liberalism, and structuralism. But if we think about what is globalization, how might we define what that is? One way to think about globalization is it's the integration of states. And it's the integration of states through more contact, communication, and trade. And so what you have is this really kind of single global system in which those processes of change increasingly binds people together. And when globalization, this term really was banted about, many people were thinking about this in economic terms, but it goes beyond economics in today's globalized world. Communication provides for instant information transfer, which for human rights is a good thing. It's easier to name and shame individuals, particularly the impact of the global economy and what's that doing to people's daily lives. And so through the internet, through Twitter, through Facebook, we're more able to quickly find out about tragedies around the world, but also human rights violations, but subsistence rights issues as well. Okay, so if we think about what the theories of international relations suggest about the effect of globalization, we really have three theories. Again, this realism, which is really mercantilism, liberalism, which is liberalism, and then Marxist or social class theory. And we talked about in general what do these theories suggest about the impact on politics and the environment, for example, and the impact of the environment on human rights. But what do these theories suggest about the impact of globalization on human rights? And so that's what we're going to try to think about. If you're a mercantilist or a realist, what kinds of impact is globalization going to have on human rights? If you're a liberal, what are the impacts of economic decisions based on economic liberalism is going to be made on human rights, and so forth and so on. And so basically we tend to focus here on the other rights that we've, as opposed to what we dealt with in Module 5 and Module 6. And this is the economic, social, and cultural rights. And this is where globalization really is at play. And so we talked a little bit about, initially, is there a hierarchy of rights? Are some rights more important than others? Should there be a hierarchy? Or is there a trade-off between types of rights? And we have talked about, and some of the readings talks about the full belly thesis, for example. Is it really important to be able to vote if you're starving to death? So studies have indicated that the achievement or realization of political and civil rights is kind of happening at the same time as economic, social, and cultural rights. Other studies have indicated it's when people become particularly economically more developed, they tend to want to have more and more political rights. So it's economic development is the requisite for political rights and democracy, for example. Then the issue is, do groups have rights? Do certain groups have rights, or is it just the individual who has the right who happens to be part of a group? And what is the answer to the difference in the realization of subsistence rights found around the globe? I mean, are some people better off than others? And of course the answer to that is yes. And is there any solution to world poverty? We've talked about the environment, we've talked about hunger, but what about poverty? So let's talk about globalization in terms of the economic sphere. And one of the issues that's high on the list of individuals dealing with globalization is fair trade, free trade, and the plight of the worker. And so one of the common questions that is banted about is the underpaid work in sweatshops around the world, and that should be eliminated and a minimum wage instituted in all countries. So what are we talking about, a minimum wage? Of course, this can be debated all day long, and this suggests that there is something called the human right to work. And we can find this in Article 23 in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so this says that everyone has the right to work, to free choice of employment, to just and favorable conditions of work, and to protection against unemployment, and to just and favorable remuneration ensuring an existence worthy of human dignity. So the Article 23 is collectively thought of as the human right to work. And the right to work guarantees the right to earn a living wage in a safe work environment and to organize and bargain collectively. So the right to work is found in many of the instruments of the human rights regime, the UDHR, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and even the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And these things include the following: the right to employment, as I said, the right to fair wages and remuneration, ensuring an existing worthy of human dignity, to safe and healthy working conditions, to reasonable limitations on working hours. And we saw from our unit on women and children that children in particular are working beyond these hours. To organize, to join a trade union, to freedom from forced or compulsory labor, to protection against unemployment, the right to rest and leisure and holidays with pay. The ILO, which is the International Labor Organization, has developed even more detailed standards in roughly 180 conventions and recommendations. And 8 of these conventions are labeled as fundamental human rights instruments and include the right to equal pay for equal work, to freedom from discrimination in the workplace, to organize and bargain collectively, to the abolition of child labor, and to freedom from forced or compulsory labor. So this really gets into this other issue now called minimum versus living wages. The right to work includes a fair or living wage, and so a living wage must do the following: allow for a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of oneself and one's family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical services. A living wage must be supplemented, if necessary, by other means of social protection, including health insurance and other benefits tied to employment. And a living wage must include equal pay for equal work and a just pay for overtime hours. Okay. And so everyone has the right to just and favorable conditions, including the right to safe and healthy working conditions, access to potable water, protections against health and safety hazards. And so this can go on and on and on in terms of a living wage. So a living wage, the idea behind a living wage is that people who work in a community should be able to live decently and raise their families there. I was working at I had a one-year position when I was still finishing up my doctorate at the University of Colorado in Boulder. And Boulder's great. It's a great place to live, but most of the faculty could not afford to live in Boulder. It was so expensive. So they had to commute from other communities closer to Denver. So those people could not work to live in the community that they worked in. Now, of course, we're talking about situations where professors are having to live in other cities. It's very different than the individual who works on a paycheck to paycheck, can't afford to live in the city that they're working. So the idea behind a living wage is that people who work in a community should be able to live decently and raise their family. And this requires a wage and benefit package that takes into account the area-specific cost of living, as well as the basic expenses involved in supporting a family. And so living wages do by definition vary by region, and so they're considerably higher than other areas. But the minimum wage does not begin to meet the needs of working people or families anywhere in the country. In fact, it puts a parent with one child below the federal poverty line. A living wage aims to correct this by establishing at a local level a more reasonable minimum wage. And so this is part of the argument about Occupy Wall Street movement. And the Occupy movement is not just in the United States. This Occupy movement is all across the globe. But this is a living wage calculator that you can go look at. And what you do is try to This is really getting at this issue of poverty in the United States. And so if you go to the state of Texas, for example, and then we want to be in Walker County, which is where Huntsville is. Okay. So the living wage shown is the hourly rate that an individual must earn to support their family if they are the sole provider and are working full-time. The state minimum wage is the same for all individuals, all right? So, and then of course the poverty rate is typically quoted as a gross annual income, but they've converted it to hourly, all right? So an adult, the living wage, you need to be making $8.69 to be able to survive. The minimum wage here, of course, is $7.25. You can see that's the minimum wage across the board. The poverty wage is for people who, under these categories. So you're considered in poverty if you make $7 an hour and you have an adult and one child. What you need is $18.14 an hour if it's you and a child you're trying to support. Because here are the living expenses for people who live in Walker County. Okay, so obviously you cannot live on the minimum wage if you are living in Walker County. All right, so we tend to think that people who are making minimum wage are those kids working at McDonald's. These are individuals, adults who have children that are also trying to make a living. So this is an issue about globalization, and you can find living wage calculators for the United States, but other countries around the globe as well. So this gets at the issue of whether or not the right to work and whether or not you can live in a certain city based on how much you're making. And globalization plays a role in that because of issues like sweatshops where people are being underpaid for the types of things that you and I purchase. All right, but what about the effect on human rights? The liberal view, and we've already talked about that a little bit in the previous lecture, suggests that increased information flow is done to decrease repression. So this is the idea that the increase in information brought about by technology, Twitter, Facebook, that's a form of globalization is going to name and shame, which is going to end up providing states with that are less likely to repress so that they're not called out on that naming and shaming. The liberal view believes that trade, international, global financial interaction is going to lead to what is called the peace dividend. That countries that trade with one another, that countries that interact with one another in this globalized world are less likely to go to war with each other because of the costs involved. Liberals also argue that there's more jobs, there's more basic services and infrastructure brought about through globalization. And that you have, with the exchange of goods, also comes the exchange of norms, and this is going to improve human rights. The critical view, on the other hand, this is some of it mercantilist, but most of it structuralist or kind of a neo-Marxist view. But it's also the feminist view, and others who are in the anti-globalization field suggest that the pressure to globalize actually increases repression. That dictators, for example, are going to hide the repressive nature in order to attract investment. That you have this increasing gap between the rich and the poor. That you have this is the Occupy Wall Street movement or the 99% movement. This is going to lead to trade-offs. We've already talked about Asian values that are postponing political and civil rights in the name of economic development. But of course, in the readings, we can see some of the ill effects of globalization on communities around the globe. So we can talk about the tragedy of Tucumaraca. And this is just the isolated village in the Peruvian Andes where this particular event occurred. There's a meeting of the parents at the school after the tragedy. So as you're reading in the book, you'll learn about what happens in this particular small town in the Peruvian Andes. And it had to do with a trade, it's a globalization issue primarily because we're talking about the movement of goods and services. In this particular case, a particular type of powdered milk substitute that that they had for school lunch, and it was contaminated by a pesticide, and got mixed in with their milk supply. Okay, so you would want to read about that story and what effect does trade have, and this goes to labeling of products in particular. So you'll want to read that and think about how do the different theories of international political economy and how does globalization impact human rights. Another article was about outsourcing. We tend to think of outsourcing as an economic adventure where we outsource things like people who telemarketing or call centers. Where we have, if you have a credit card problem, you call and you get to somebody, talk to somebody in a different country in particular. But Neve Gordon talks about another globalizing issue, the outsourcing, and doesn't really talk about the outsourcing of human rights violations. And so one of the things that you're going to want to be able to answer is, according to Gordon, why do firms outsource? Okay, why do multinational corporations outsource some of their work? And for some people, they argue that this is a way to avoid dealing with some of the economic and social parameters dealing with the work that's done. This is how sweatshops start. If you go down to the Mexican border with Texas, there's the maquiladoras down there where many U.S. companies have shifted their production to right across the Rio Grande so that they don't have to comply with many of the EPA standards or labor standards that are in the United States. So what is the connection between outsourcing and human rights violations? And then what are the consequences of outsourcing in general or in terms of human rights? And so this is a quote from Gordon. He says, outsourcing is, however, not employed merely as a strategy to help the perpetuate or abdicate responsibility for the violations it authorizes. It also assists the aggressor in maintaining a respectable aura in the public eye. It isn't the United States that tortures al-Qaeda suspect, Egypt does. It isn't the transnational corporation that neglects the health of its employees, but rather it's a subsidy in Thailand. And so we can also start to talk about the outsourcing of torture. And this is where the United States doesn't torture on the United States soil, but it exports many suspects to countries that will do the torturing in order to find information that the United States thinks is useful. The other article that you're going to come across, there's two different articles. One is by Harrelson Stevens, and the other one is by McCorkerdale and Fairbrother. And here we're looking at different issues of globalization that might inhibit the realization of human rights. So we're thinking about the different types of investment, different bases for investment decisions. And so why do certain countries invest in dams and roads and runways and large-scale commercial projects as opposed to little investment in primary health care, water, basic education? In other words, why aren't they investing in human capital? And then what's the basis for these investment decisions? Generally, firms base their decisions on financial concerns and not so much the social welfare of the state. Will the project be profitable? MNCs are not benevolent enterprises, on the other hand. The purpose is to generate a profit. The policies of global economic institutions are often detrimental at the individual level while attempting to correct some aggregate economic issue. And so there's different types of economic growth, and how do we measure that kind of economic growth? So what you're going to be asked to do for the writing response to this particular unit is to look at these two articles. What are the basic arguments of each? What are the research methods? What data do they use? And then what conclusions do we draw, and how would you compare and contrast these two particular articles in the textbook? Then there's an interesting piece by Singer. This is referred to as the Singer Solution to Poverty. And he says, what is the ethical distinction between a Brazilian who sells a homeless child to organ peddlers and an American who already has a TV, and upgrades to a better one, knowing that that money could be donated to an organization that would use it to save the lives of kids in need. And he says it's wrong to live well without giving substantial amounts of money to help people who are hungry, malnourished, or dying from easily treatable illnesses like diarrhea. And he further says, knowing that a donation of $200 will help a sick 2-year-old child live to be a healthy 6-year-old, how should you judge yourself if you don't donate the money? So what is Singer's solution to poverty? He says, I can see no escape from the conclusion that each one of us with wealth surplus to his or her essential needs should be giving most of it to help people suffering from poverty so dire as to be life-threatening. What he's saying is that those of us who have disposable income should be giving most of that disposable income to organizations or to others that can help people who are suffering from poverty or other types of illness, life-threatening illnesses. And this is going to be the basis of the discussion on the discussion board. So I'm very interested to see how you all assess Singer's argument and whether or not you agree with his solution to poverty. And that concludes the lectures on Module 7.